I believe we have Greg Barnes with us. Greg, can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Hi, thank you for joining us so much. It's an honor to have you.
That's all right. No problem.
So I wanted to start right off with what the Australian political situation is regarding Julian Assange. I know you have a lot of legal expertise, especially in this area. So what do you see happening right now and in the last few months since Julian Assange has been silenced?
Well, I wrote a piece which is published on today's Fairfax Media here in Australia, which is the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, making the point that Malcolm Turnbull and Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister, and Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister, to their credit, have not joined in the baying for blood that we've seen from Pompeo and Sessions and co. I think this provides an opportunity for Australia to play the role of a middle power here and to get the assurance from the United States that it will not seek extradition, that it will allow Julian Assange to leave the embassy and to either come back to Australia or alternatively to safe passage to Ecuador.
And so what are some of the changes specifically that you've seen just in the last few weeks that if you'd like to comment on them?
Well, look, I think that the situation now, and I've certainly had this communication with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, as has Julian's father, which is that the situation is that you've got a person who's now incommunicado, as it were, who's been locked away for 6 years, coming up for 6 years. There needs to be an endpoint. There needs to be an endpoint for a range of reasons, but primarily because we've got a human being who's got family in Australia, his mother and his father, both of whom I know well, who are terrific people, getting older here in Australia. And he is an Australian citizen, and Australia has an obligation to ensure that its citizens are not facing the prospect of torture.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things we were discussing earlier with John Kiriakou is the fact that solitary confinement is torture, and that is a very, very real impact on any human being that goes through that situation. So how did you get involved with Assange? Can you give the audience a sense of the story as it's related to yourself in connecting with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and all of that history?
Well, I was a strong supporter of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks when the news broke of the Iraq and Afghanistan revelations. As I was involved in the Australian Lawyers Alliance, which is a progressive group of lawyers in Australia, and as a key spokesperson for the Alliance, we strongly backed Julian Assange's right to freedom of speech, and we were particularly scathing about then Prime Minister Julia Gillard saying that he'd committed criminal acts in Australia, which was palpably wrong. We then gave some briefings to various parliamentary committees. We also, I can say, then continued to agitate on Julian Assange's behalf. I was asked to assist Julian when he ran for the Senate in the federal election in 2013. And I've maintained a close involvement with Julian, both as a lawyer, but also with trying to add some political expertise ever since. And I'm in regular contact with Julian and with members of his family and other members of the legal team.
And because of your immense legal expertise, can you please comment for the audience on the injustice of the way that Julian Assange has been treated and the ways that the treatment really does go against the letter of the law in so many ways? Because I know that that's a huge topic.
Well, sure. Well, it does in a range of ways. Firstly, let's say this was just a normal case where a person had skipped bail or breached their bail. They would be dealt with by an English court purely on the basis of, look, we're going to impose a fine, don't do it again, and off you go. That's the first point. That hasn't happened. The second point that I'd make is the United States has been running a secret grand jury process. And we now know that this is fact, despite the mainstream media continuing to pour scorn on the idea. We now know it's a fact because we've seen the comments in recent times relating to arrest of Julian Assange being a priority. So we have a person who has had to, the only way that they could stay safe, the only way that they could prevent being refooled, to use the immigration term, to the United States was to seek refuge and seek asylum. Now, normally when a person seeks asylum, there are some diplomatic niceties which take place globally because all countries know that they could be in this situation one day. and a person is allowed safe access, for example, to medical care, which has not been allowed by the British here. And they're also allowed safe access to the airport so they can go to the country from which they have sought asylum. The UK government's conduct has been appalling. I mean, for a government and for a country which purports to uphold the rule of law, the conduct has been well short of that. So that's the legal landscape, if you like. I mean, I have to say, I think at the end of the day, this has now become a completely political issue. And like a lot of these legal issues where you're involving people who are seen as political, it is a political solution in the end. And we've seen that in Australia with a number of people in China, for example, who've been caught up in the Chinese legal system and been detained. The solution at the end of the day has not been legal. The solution has been political. And that's not to criticise my colleagues or myself in any way, but at the end of the day, the courts work within a framework. That framework can really only be shifted, I think, with political goodwill.
That's really important for our audience to hear. You know, somebody with your expertise legally to say that it is up to us to fight for Julian Assange is really, really impactful. It's a message that people truly need to understand. So from your perspective, what are some of the ways that the audience can actively and tangibly help Julian Assange and WikiLeaks right now in the best way possible?
Look, I think building momentum, particularly amongst younger voters. I'll give you an example. In Australia, over 10 years ago now, David Hicks, who was a young Australian who went to allegedly fight with Al-Qaeda, effectively found himself on the wrong side of the war in 2002 or 1 or 2, was taken to Guantanamo Bay. Most people didn't have a lot of time for David Hicks, but what they didn't have a lot of time for was the Australian government allowing a fellow citizen to be palpably tortured at Guantanamo Bay. And it was young voters particularly, and getting online and getting really active and harassing MPs, I mean in a civil fashion, but harassing MPs to get change. And it eventually built up enough momentum that it was a very conservative government of John Howard that brought him home.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think that a lot of times supporters of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks underestimate their own power in this situation and the ability they have to really actually change the situation with something that seems to a lot of people to not amount to much, to tweet at their representative, to send letters. But from what you're saying, that is incredibly important and incredibly necessary.
I worked in politics for 12 years as a political advisor. Politicians react to volume. They react in democracies. They react to volume. When they see in their electorate office a huge number of letters and emails and tweets coming in, when they saw them coming in for David Hicks, they knew, as they would say, it was a barbecue stopper conversation. In other words, the average Joe was talking about this on the weekend. It wasn't just activists. And I think that's very important with Julian. If you talk to about Julian to people, and I do it regularly, most people say, yeah, it is pretty unfair. Australia should be doing something. And we need a lot more of that because the Australian government is instrumental to this. At the end of the day, he's an Australian citizen. Yes, he's an Ecuadorian citizen, but he has not renounced his Australian citizenship. He's got family ties here, strong ties to this jurisdiction. Not only that, Australia purports to have some leverage over the UK and Washington because it's a strong ally of both. It's in a perfect position, but it will need a strong campaign on behalf of Australians, but not only Australians, people around the world saying to the Australian government, do something.
And I know that in the last few days, I've seen a number of tweets from WikiLeaks and I believe WikiLeaks Task Force and the Julian Assange Twitter account to the effect of a lot of activity going on the ground with young people and college students, university students who are protesting and acting for Assange. Can you give any perspective on like the mood in Australia? Like how much are Australian citizens aware and supportive of Assange?
Well, I don't think enough. In fact, I had a meeting with a really bright young guy the other day who's involved in a young tech startup here in Australia, in Melbourne. He made a really good point about the Assange support base in Australia. It needs more younger voters, under 30 voters, and he's right. And I think one of the reasons you haven't got it is because it's gone on so long. Julian and the mainstream media in Australia, quite frankly, has been disgraceful in the treatment of the Assange case. My article today is about the first time, and it's to the credit of Fairfax Media that they ran it, It's about the first time Assange has had an opportunity to present to the mainstream media. I think, Elizabeth, you did an interview this morning with Ross Cameron on Sky, and that's because I didn't get out of bed early enough, and he said he'd got you, so well done, which was great.
It was an honour to speak with him. That was definitely...
No, it was great, because more voices are better. And see, he's coming from a sort of right-wing perspective, and he's a Murdoch media outlet. So today we covered Murdoch and Fairfax, the two big media outlets. But it needs the journalists to be following up questions as they did with David Hicks. We had Canberra press gallery journalists, the political journalists with Hicks saying, Prime Minister, what have you done? We need those sorts of questions being asked by journalists in Australia of the Prime Minister and the opposition leader.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing. So what is the difference between something like Bill Hicks and this case? Why is it that those same journalists are not speaking out for Assange? Has something changed in the situation where they've become more indebted to the unelected power structure, or is it just that they don't feel for Assange? What do you think?
Look, it's a really good question. David Hicks had a strong following in the mainstream media. Outrageously, there are some journalists in Australia who don't like Assange. A journalist for whom I have a great deal of respect once said to me, you've got to understand, most of the journalists in Canberra, in Australia's capital, hate Assange because he does their job better than they do. And there's some truth in that.
Yeah, that jealousy might be an unexamined aspect of this that people don't...
Yeah, and look, I think, and, you get snide remarks from journalists, leading journalists in Australia about Assange. But can I say this about it? What they need is focusing on the fact that you have an Australian citizen who is being subjected to torture and will be subjected to torture if he is allowed to be extradited to Washington. That's what they should focus on. Forget about Julian Assange, the journalist. As I said in the Age today, you don't have to agree with everything. You don't have to support Assange, but you do have to support a principle that says the Australian government has an obligation to ensure that its citizens are not subjected to torture.
And that's why this vigil is so fantastic. I mean, we have you on, we have Ross Cameron on, two Australians from different maybe ends of the political spectrum, and you're both
Ross and I work together. Yeah. I mean, Ross comes from the other side. Although I started life in the Liberal Party, but left over the cruel policies towards asylum seekers. But look, there are people in Canberra, are politicians who are very good on the Assange issue. There are also some people who are outrageously bad, but. I have to say, in fairness to the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, who I've known for a long time, I ran the Republic campaign for him here in 1999. He's been circumspect about the matter. He has shown interest in the matter when I've raised it with him. And he hasn't, as I said, joined in the sort of blood-curdling cries that we've seen from the Trump administration, or Hillary Clinton for that matter, about Julian.
That's very, very interesting. And it definitely raises some sort of possibility of hope that if there is an increased level of pressure from college students, from people within Australia on the Prime Minister, that maybe there's some hope that they would actually take action for Assange. And that's some really good news, that we have so much bad news with Julian and with WikiLeaks at the moment. We have smears. There's all sorts of stuff that is really unfortunate. But hearing that is at least something that people can grab hold of.
And look, I don't want to overrate it. There's a lot of work to do. There's an election coming up here anytime really from now until the middle of next year. The other pressure point, of course, is in the Senate. The Australian Senate works on the basis that it's an elected body. It's a bit like the US Senate. The government needs its support to pass bills. We're urging senators, particularly what we call crossbench senators who don't belong to the major parties, to be saying to the Prime Minister, look, I'll support your legislation if I see that you're serious about doing something for Julian Assange.
Yeah, making that such a top priority is definitely something that has to happen. From your perspective, what can viewers do, let's say in the US or from outside Australia? Can there be any impact from outside Australia on the Australian support for Assange, or do you think that people should basically focus on efforts in their own countries?
Oh, no, look, I think pressure on the Australian government. When Hicks was around as an issue, I remember there were people in the United States putting pressure on Australia. I think particularly when Americans do it, it has resonance here. And people in the UK, when they do it, it has resonance here. So there's certainly an opportunity for people to be saying to Australia, you can play a very constructive part in a resolution of this matter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so are there any aspects of Assange's legal case and the persecution of WikiLeaks that you think has not been effectively reported by the press? I mean, like, really has not been given any light of day that you'd like to tell our audience about?
Oh, look, I think that the legal team in London, my colleagues over there, have done a tremendous job in very difficult circumstances. I think that the reporting of the cases themselves has been okay. But I'm surprised that, for example, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, when it reported, it did get some press, but then it died away very, very quickly. I mean, this is a very distinguished body, as you rightly pointed out. It includes some of the best international human rights law scholars in the world. It's not, in other words, a political UN organisation like some organisations. In other words, it's effectively a distinguished court with people who are not political making judgments. And I've been surprised at how Australian journalists have not continued to pick that up and say, look, this UN working group is a very distinguished, apolitical, non-partisan group. It has been very clear in what it has said. You have an Australian who's been arbitrarily detained. Australia needs to do something about it. As, by the way, Australia regularly does with people who get caught in Bali with drugs or get caught in China.
Yes, I'm aware of some of those really horror stories in that on that subject, definitely. And I think that it's also been interesting. I remember recently there was the UK ruling against Assange's legal team, you included, that basically it dismissed the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and it was extremely flippant. And I wondered if you had any comment on that. And
I think it was a very narrow judgment, a very black letter law judgment. I'll say this tragically. I think some of my colleagues and some judicial officers take a very black and white view of the law, and what is required is some imaginative judicial decision making, and good judges make decisions and make sure that justice gets accorded in cases. I think that's what I'll say about it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for just kind of expanding on that a little bit. Other than the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, are there any aspects of the rulings that have been in Assange's favor that have not been reported on? I mean, I know that we've seen that the media definitely dismisses the United Nations Working Group's ruling, but is there anything else that they also dismiss that you'd like to raise with us?
Well, I think they have been extraordinarily uninquiring, or lacking in inquiry, if I can put it that way, when they haven't continued to pursue the Americans over the secret grand jury processes. I mean, the bottom line is that the United States has been pursuing a secret grand jury process over Assange for a long period of time, and yet there's been a reluctance on the part of the mainstream media to pursue that. I think the other issue is that this is a human rights issue, and the problem is people have conflated it. They've said, I don't like Julian Assange, I don't like what he's doing, therefore I'm not going to see it as a human rights issue. Human rights are human rights, irrespective of whom that person is. In fact, sensibly, I had a judicial officer in this country the other day, nothing to do with the case, but we were chatting about Assange, and he said to me, he said, look, I'm not a great fan of Julian, but what is happening is outrageous. And I said, you get it, you understand it. It's not about whether you support Julian or don't. In this sense, it's actually about the human rights of an individual and making sure those rights are respected.
Absolutely. And when you discussed just now the way that the press has not followed up on the massive mobilization of the US government and multiple agencies against Assange, I myself was really surprised to see the extent of the reporting on that initially in 2010 that has now just dropped off the radar completely. So I was wondering if you could walk through for us and the audience the history of the case legally for surrounding Assange and WikiLeaks, just a breakdown of how this has developed since 2010.
Well, others can probably do a better job than me, but I can say, certainly since 2010, they must have spent literally now hundreds of millions of dollars, US Department of Justice, in pursuing this matter, looking at espionage charges. They got Manning in the most disgraceful circumstances and a very unjust process, but they're continuing to pursue the matter. Now, they've done so in secrecy, which makes a mockery of, again, a country which says we believe in a system of open justice. This has been a deception on the American people. It's been a deception on Julian Assange and his legal team. There have been no other nations, now that Sweden has dropped out of the picture, there are no other nations that are so bloodthirsty, if I can put it that way, in their pursuit of Julian Assange as we see from the United States. I can say the Australian government, there are no legal actions in Australia, to my knowledge. In fact, he committed no breaches of Australian law, and that was put to bed very early on. There have been no breaches of UK law. There have been no breaches of US law. But the United States is determined, and I think being allied with some journalists who are prepared to do its dirty work in pursuing an anti-Assange agenda. I mean, you'd have to say, if Julian Assange were tried in a US court with a jury, whether or not he would have any chance of a fair trial, because the polluting of the waters in the United States by the many members of the mainstream media, particularly CNN and Washington Post and others, well, not so much Washington Post, but New York Times and others, and working hand in glove with the Department of Justice, it seems, would make it extremely difficult.
Absolutely. And so can you walk us through a little bit of how it developed from 2010 onwards? I know that we saw, but our viewers may not be familiar with the all of government efforts that were launched and mobilized against WikiLeaks. Can you describe that a little bit? And really
So in addition to pursuing espionage charges on the basis of leaks of material and publication, they also decided to close down the donations regime so that people couldn't fund WikiLeaks. So here we have an NGO in the form of WikiLeaks, where the US government took action and made threats to banks, credit card companies, you name it, they did it. And that's continued. So we had that as well. And then we've had, there's no doubt, US working assiduously with the British to make sure that Julian Assange's rights, normal rights, for example, the right to healthcare, which he can't exercise because he can't leave the embassy without the threat of arrest, that the usual diplomatic forms and conventions which apply to persons who seek asylum have not been honoured. So it's been a relentless pursuit by the United States Department of Justice and both sides of politics. I mean, Hillary Clinton was appalling on the Assange issue, as is Jeff Sessions, as is Mike Pompeo, as is Representative Adam Schiff, who's looking at so-called Russian activities. Now, you know, there's been a complete, for your listeners, there's been a complete absence of any fairness or respect for the rule of law. I mean, normally one should be circumspect if there is a suspect in a case. I'm not saying Julian's a suspect, but certainly if there's a person that police want to speak to or authorities want to speak to, they should be circumspect about it, not running it through the newspapers, not running it through the media, not running it through the Congress, not running it politically. But this has been a completely political exercise on the part of the United States legal and espionage establishment to get a person who was doing no more than other journalists do, and that is to publish materials which the state doesn't want to see published.
Absolutely. And I have a question here from Twitter that says, is there any hope of Julian Assange being reconnected? And I would add to that, what is the level of hope that you see for Assange being reconnected in the near future? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I noticed the comments of President Moreno the other day, which look, and those who are more closely advising in London should answer this, but certainly one would have thought that at the very least, and here again is something I think the Australian government could do. It could, Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister, could pick up the phone to President Moreno and say, look, this guy's an Australian citizen. He is entitled, when he seeks asylum, to the ordinary rights of other citizens of Ecuador. That includes right to the internet. There ought to be a compromise here. These things are always capable of compromise when one party takes a particularly swift and harsh action, and one would hope that there is some compromise reached. But I know John Pilger, amongst others, has been sceptical about President Moreno and and his close ties to the United States. And look, once again, all roads here do lead to the United States. So in part, the answer to the question is this depends on the United States.
Very, very important for people to understand that, and the importance then of raising, support for Assange in the US for sure. And another question I have is about the sort of collusion between the US and the Swedish authorities regarding the investigation, which is now dropped, because that is one of the huge smears that is leveled against Assange is in regards to that. So I'd like if you could explain exactly how that stands and exactly the extent to which that was a farce and a facade. That would be fantastic. I think people need to hear that.
So the way the Swedish system works, a prosecutor has the right to issue an arrest warrant, to speak to a person about allegations before they're charged. I might say that the English courts and a number of other courts have been very, very not so much hostile, but quizzical about that power, because normally you can only arrest someone if you're going to charge them.
And I'd like to just jump in and say I want to correct myself. I misspoke. I said US and Swedish. I meant UK and Swedish.
Yeah, UK
just
Swedish.
Slipped my mind. Yes, sorry.
Look, the other point is that the prosecutor in Sweden refused to come to London to interview Julian, despite the fact that Sweden regularly and routinely does it, and despite the fact, by the way, Australian police, as I made the point here to the media, Australian police often go overseas to speak with people and interview people. The person does not have to come to Australia. She refused to do so. She continued this case despite there being a real level of concern about this case in the Swedish legal profession, including amongst her colleagues. And the United Kingdom, as we now know from documents from the Crown Prosecution Service, I think behaved disgracefully. I think that what we had was a case where lawyers were acting in a very political fashion. Some might say, and I probably do too, the law is always political, but this was overtly political, overtly running the agendas or political agendas or diplomatic agendas when their only concern should have been fairness to the person in respect of whom they sought to speak, and closing off the investigation as quickly as possible, either by charging or discharging. But what we saw here was a very political delays, the British telling the prosecutor in Sweden not to come to London. It's appalling conduct. If prosecutors did that here, and it was found out, there'd certainly be ethics committees and others having a look at their conduct, and rightly so.
Yeah, and to remind our viewers, for those who don't have the context with these particular documents that you're mentioning regarding the Crown Prosecution Service, those were won by Stephanie Marizzi, an amazing journalist who was able to publish those as a result of a Freedom of Information Act issue. So I know that some of our viewers will be familiar, some may not be. The other thing that I was wondering from your perspective as a legal representative of Julian Assange in Australia, one of the aspects that I've noticed doesn't seem to be remembered by people is this connection between the prosecutor of Julian Assange in the UK and the Pinochet case, and then same with his lawyer Garzon, who has obviously was prosecuting against Pinochet. Can you bring this story to life for people who maybe never heard about it or forgot about it?
Sure. So Augusto Pinochet was a Chilean dictator, for those who are young enough not to remember him. Lucky you. He then ended up fleeing to London in the early 1990s, from memory. And there were demands that he return to Chile. But he was, in effect, allowed to remain in London. He was interviewed. And, in fact, there was English court proceedings around Pinochet and around the question as to whether or not prosecutors should come to him as opposed to him having to go to Chile. And so the Swedish prosecutor seems to have forgotten, and Marion and I seem to have forget some of those fundamental principles in Julian Assange's case.
Yeah, you definitely. I thought it was timely to bring up because you see not only the role reversal in terms of the individual lawyers themselves, but definitely the hypocrisy when we know that Assange is suffering medically and he's not allowed to have medical care versus somebody who was involved in extremely.
I should add that the other aspect of Pinochet was that Pinochet was effectively given rolled gold treatment by the United Kingdom government. The government of Margaret Thatcher and then John Major. And in fact, Mrs. Thatcher was a great supporter of Augusto Pinochet. I should have mentioned that. And look, there are other examples. There are other examples of people who have fled jurisdictions and because of investigations, they've gone to other jurisdictions and they have been treated very well. So what does it say to you? Well, what it says to you is that countries such as the UK, which purport to uphold the rule of law and say that the law applies equally to everyone, are talking through their hats because that's not the case. It's clearly not the case, and we've seen that in the Assange case writ large, as it were.
Absolutely. And I think that the fact that that type of history is not talked about consistently is one of the things that really hides the level to which it's so clear that he's a political prisoner. And that's...
I could not agree more. I mean, there's no doubt he's a political prisoner. And if Julian Assange, for example, had, revealed caches of documents from Beijing or from Moscow or wherever, he would be feted as a hero. I can say to you, in Australia, for example, where there's an extraordinary level of paranoia about China at the moment, journalists are regularly getting feeds from security agencies and allegedly revealing various aspects of Chinese policy. They're not being arrested. They're being feted as heroes within Australia and presumably by the US Embassy in Canberra. Whereas because Julian Assange reveals the truth about what happened in two appalling wars, in which Australia is a very active participant, he gets punished. So, as I say, the rule of law either applies or it doesn't apply. But the next time you hear Theresa May or any other politician talk about the commitment in liberal democracy to the rule of law, you should take it with a grain of salt.
Absolutely. And from your perspective, what has been the harm against the public in terms of the funds spent policing the embassy, in terms of the energy of public funds used to prosecute and to police Julian Assange? What does that do to the public? How does that harm them and not just Julian and WikiLeaks?
Well, I think it harms the public by saying these are tens and hundreds of millions of dollars spent on pursuing a person whose only crime, in inverted commas, has been to publish documents that the government doesn't want published. How many hospitals, how many schools, how many kids who need care can that support? And I think rightly people in a democracy get very sick and tired of the security state and police and others pursuing with a vengeance people. When that money could be much better spent on effectively caring for the people of that particular jurisdiction. And if I was a citizen of the UK, I'd be mighty pissed off, to use the vernacular, with the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent there rather than my kids' school, where you got teachers, for example, as happens in Australia, putting their hands in their own pockets to buy equipment for the kids because there's not enough money. As a matter of equity and fairness in society, this pursuit is outrageous.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the security state. And I think in a lot of ways, maybe especially recently, we've seen that the security state does seem to, reach across the Atlantic between the US and the UK. And I was wondering if I could get your comment on the UK and the US working together to extradite Julian Assange to the US for an unfair prosecution.
I've got no doubt that they work closely together. The US is part of the Five Eyes for your listeners and viewers. That is Australia, the UK, I think Canada, New Zealand. I left one out, but we got 4 out of the 5. I can't remember the fifth one, but effectively there is an intelligence sharing agreement between all those countries. They all work hand in glove. Although I have to say about New Zealand, it has a very principled Prime Minister. It is very prepared to stand up to the United States and has been for many, many years. It's a pity Julian Assange is not a New Zealander because if he were, I can tell you now, Jacinda Ardern, who was recently in London, would have raised the case with Theresa May, and certainly there would be much greater support. But unfortunately, he's not a New Zealander, and he's an Australian. But the security agencies and police agencies of all those countries in the Five Eyes, they share information. They work hand in glove on extradition. There's absolutely no doubt the United Kingdom would be playing a role.
Absolutely. And I have a question from a viewer, from Glenn McGrath, who says Julian's bail appeal failed in February. Can and will that result be challenged? And I thought that you'd be uniquely able to answer that.
I don't think it has been. I haven't spoken to my colleagues in London about it as to whether or not it would be challenged. I don't think it has been, and I suspect the appeal has run out. But look, if there is other news on that, please let me know. But I'm not aware of it. Difficult often to appeal those sorts of rulings, because at the end of the day, it depends on the discretion exercised by the court. And what appeal courts say is, look, as long as the discretion wasn't outrageous, even though we may not have decided the same way, we're not going to overturn the decision. So it's difficult to appeal those sorts of decisions.
Absolutely. And so and going back to just in the early months of this year, we all learned that Ecuador had given, and this is completely, changing subjects pretty drastically, but we learned that Ecuador had not only given Assange citizenship, but they had also given him diplomatic status. So can you explain how it is that the UK was able to basically ignore that designation in regards to Assange? And if that was actually,
a country does not have to accept diplomatic status. So when you are a diplomat and you go to a country, you have to present your credentials. I think is the term that's used. Certainly ambassadors need to do that, and other senior diplomatic staff. And a country doesn't have to accept. A country can say, we're not going to accept that person. And the United Kingdom stood on its ground, its diplomatic ground, in doing that. I might say in circumstances where it would have been a very neat outcome, I would have thought, for Theresa May and the United Kingdom government to say, well, yes, we'll accept it, and therefore because he has diplomatic status, he can leave the embassy with that immunity, go to the airport and go to Ecuador. But I think if there's any clearer indication that the United Kingdom is working actively with the United States at the government level to have him extradited, that was the test, because that was an elegant solution. It was a fair solution, but it wasn't taken up by the UK government. And I think what that shows is the UK government is just as bloody-minded about this issue as the United States.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I have another question from a viewer that sort of moves on from that question. It's from Tristan Sykes, and he said, is there any way to enforce the UN ruling for Assange being illegally detained or arbitrarily detained, or is international law and human rights effectively toothless in the face of Pax Americana? And I think that goes exactly to the previous issue of the diplomatic community.
Unfortunately, he's right. The great problem of international law, whether you be dealing with Wales or Julian Assange, is that the enforceability of rulings depend on the goodwill of governments. We've seen in Australia, I do a lot of work for refugees here, we've seen in Australia a number of United Nations ruling condemning Australia's cruelty towards refugees, asylum seekers. The Australian government has taken no notice of it. And the same with Japan when it came to Wales in the Southern Ocean. And the same when it comes to Julian Assange. Of course, it does show the gross hypocrisy of the way in which the system works, because countries do like to accept international law rulings when it suits them, but not on other occasions.
And and Tristan Sykes actually has another question leading on from that, saying, are there any legal consequences for these bad actors in failing to apply that law? And I think you've pretty much answered that, but I thought I would.
I think I've answered the question.
Yeah, that definitely leads on from that. And do you have any? I know that though Assange is in basically solitary confinement, he does have access to his legal team. Is there any update on his current status that you're willing to give us or able to give us? Because people are very worried about Julian Assange, and they really want to hear.
He's remarkably resilient. Most of us would have gone stark raving mad. But there needs to be an end point to this. You can't have a person living in a small apartment in London with no access to natural light forever and a day.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know that a lot of our viewers have asked how he's holding up. So I'm glad to hear that he is as resilient as ever. That's really a positive piece of news. So I'm just looking through the social media questions we've been given. So I've just answered one of them, but so again, and this returns to something we've already discussed a little bit, but Angel Renee asks, what are the chances that Australia would stand up for Assange?
I can hear my phone ringing, but I'm going to keep you on.
Not a problem. Not a problem. I'm just looking through these questions. It's not it's a good time for that type of interruption, I suppose. So actually, somebody titling themselves Navigator1An asked, if I left Julian Assange or WikiLeaks something in my will, where could I send a copy to? I don't know if that's something that you've dealt with, but
sorry. So the question is, if I've left Assange something or WikiLeaks something in my will, where do I send a copy of that to? I don't know if that's a very good question. Julian probably has the answer to that. And if that person wants to get in touch with me, just send me a direct message, DM me, or I'll see what I can find out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I thought that as a legal representative of Julian, that would definitely be the question to ask you. And then this relates to his how he's doing. Harold Hedge asks if he's getting good food, and again, if you can provide any news on him. And I understand that. Yeah.
Look, I think the problem is, Elizabeth, that it doesn't matter about your nutrition. It doesn't matter what exercise you're getting. A person who's been arbitrarily detained without any natural light for 6 years is going to suffer. I mean, I do a lot of work for prisoners, even those in solitary confinement, which as tragically occurs in Australia, would get at least an hour out of their cell each day. So these conditions are worse than are endured by any prisoner in the world.
That's such an important topic, because I think that so many people dismiss what he's going through because they misunderstand the effect of solitary confinement and the situation that he's in. They really, it's not understood well enough.
Solitary confinement is unlawful as a matter of international law. It's unlawful in some countries which actually care to document and enforce human rights. But he is effectively in a solitary confinement situation.
Absolutely. And, it's such a small amount of time that can make such a medical difference in these situations. So, for example, the limit, we discussed this a little bit earlier, but the limit legally when solitary confinement is labeled torture is just 15 days. And as we know, Julian has now been through quadruple that limit. So, and the other question I have for you that's related to that is, and we've mentioned this previously in the stream, but I want to ask you, Assange, WikiLeaks has published medical reports on Julian Assange from, I believe, 2015. And in those reports, he was already, it seems, suffering some ill effects of isolation at that time. So I was wondering about your perspective on just the level of effect that isolation has, even prior to the current solitary confinement, and just how serious that is, so our viewers understand.
I mean, I'm not a doctor, but you don't have to be a doctor to know that, and certainly I've acted for prisoners who've endured very harsh conditions, and refugees and others. Detention is hard. Detention physically and mentally harms people, whether it's 1 day or 20,000 days. Detention is a form of punishment, and it does harm people. And the longer a person is detained, the longer they're forced to live in an environment or exist in an environment that is inherently deleterious, the greater the suffering and the greater the harm to themselves. And that's no different for Julian as it is for any other person.
Absolutely.
But as it's worse in this sense that he's got no natural light. And that I think is quite appalling that the United Kingdom government wouldn't even, for example, countenance an arrangement where he could, for example, walk out, even if they want to put him in handcuffs, walk out and down the street and round the block each day as a form of exercise. I mean, sheer humanity would tell you that you should do that, but it seems that sheer humanity is sadly missing in this whole saga.
Absolutely. And that seems to be actually a weapon. That inability itself seems to be something from just observing it that they're trying to, force him to leave the embassy through methods.
I mean, it's a form of cruelty to say, we're going to make conditions so horrific that we want you to leave. Mind you, the Australian government does that to asylum seekers on Nauru and Manus Island. we will make these conditions so hellish that you'll give up your fight and you'll just head back to Iran or Afghanistan where, you'll be killed. It's the same sick logic in play.
We definitely see that a lot as well in the US prison system. There's a lot of awful treatment.
Absolutely.
But in returning to the embassy itself, we since Julian Assange has been cut off from communications this time, people are asking constantly, and I know that this is something that cannot be done, but people are asking, can we somehow get him internet from outside if we make there are over and over again, we have people ask us that. So can you explain to our audience so they understand? You can't.
You can't. I mean, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a tech expert.
Yeah, so I know, but
But it's as I understand it, the system's completely jammed. I remember when I was over there in 2013, spent some time with him, and I was going to use my phone to do something. He said, "Don't bother because it just gets scrambled. It's surveilled and jammed to within an inch of its life."
And speaking of being surveilled as well, I know that The Guardian released a number of hit pieces against Assange, and part of that was that that his legal team's meetings with him had been surveilled and recorded. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that you wanted to share on how.
Well, look, the Guardian's conduct, I think, was appalling. I mean, it's odd that a newspaper which purports to be progressive, purports to support freedom of speech, and purports in particular to be opposed to torture and unlawful detention, would decide to spend so much time and effort in what were palpably, cheap journalistic shots. Can I say in relation to surveillance of legal meetings, that is unlawful. Legal meetings are privileged. Any lawyer who has a meeting with a client, those meetings are privileged, and you are not allowed to, it's a breach of law to surveil them, let alone to bug them. It's certainly a breach of law even to surveil them.
Absolutely. And that is such an important, I mean, there are so many aspects of this that do not receive obviously enough attention, and the gravity of these facets of the persecution of Assange is so underestimated, I think, by so many people. Are there any other aspects of the case or of the current situation that you want to update our viewers on, or to encourage them to act in any way?
Sure. I think, Elizabeth, just to go back to finish off, just to go back to what we talked about at the start, I really urge particularly younger Australians who are watching this, New Zealanders, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, get onto Twitter. Malcolm Turnbull is tech savvy, our Prime Minister. He's got his own Twitter. I think it's Turnbull Malcolm. It's a simple one like that. Get onto that, not with abuse, but constructively saying, hey, big chance here for Australia to help a citizen who really, really needs that support. They can retweet my article today from the Fairfax Media. They can, I'm Barnes Greg. It's my Twitter feed, BARNS, no E. There's a guy in Texas actually called Greg Barnes with the same spelling, and he and I get, he's a storm chaser. He chases Texas storms. So sometimes I get these, hey, great storm chase, Greg, and I don't know what they're talking about. Then I get it. But anyway, I'm Barnes Greg, not Greg Barnes. So Barnes Greg. And email the Prime Minister's office. The Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, same thing. I mean, Labor needs to join in on this as well, the opposition. They will possibly be the government here next year. So Bill Shorten, the opposition leader. Penny Wong, the opposition shadow spokesperson. Julie Bishop, the foreign minister. You've got to really hammer these people. But as I say, not with abuse, but just, this is an Australian citizen who needs assistance in the same way many Australian citizens need assistance. He's got to get it because that's your duty as a government.
Absolutely. And that goes to, that actually answers a question that I had not asked from Greg, which asks how we can help convince Malcolm Turnbull to explore diplomatic options, and do we write tweet blogs? So that definitely answers that that question.
I think also in London, if you're in London, go to the Australian High Commission. George Brandis, who's now the High Commissioner, is the former Attorney General here. He knows this case very well, very well. He didn't do anything on it when he was Attorney General, but he is now the Australian High Commissioner in London. Get onto the Australian High Commission, hammer them, because they've done nothing. Partly because Alexander Downer was there, who's extremely conservative and a supporter of the United States. Brandis likes to see himself more as a small L liberal, as a more genuine liberal than conservative. Well, let's see, George, if you as the Australian High Commissioner, with the #1 detainee in the United Kingdom, whether you can actually put into effect some of the principles you say you've got. And Australians and others in the United Kingdom should be going to the Australian High Commission, getting in touch with the Australian High Commission, and really putting pressure on Brandis as High Commissioner to act.
Absolutely. And speaking of that type of action and reaching out and letter writing, tweeting, and all of that, I know that the Assange legal team and especially one of the Twitter accounts at Assange Legal recently put out a post, I believe in the last 2 days, that was encouraging supporters of WikiLeaks to not only talk to their representatives and everything that we've already discussed in this segment, but also to put pressure on humanitarian NGOs, press freedom, all of the NGOs that should be supporting Assange but aren't.
Be supporting. Amnesty. Amnesty should be supporting this cause. Reporters Without Borders. Human Rights Watch. This should be bread and butter for them. Leave aside the fact that they mightn't always agree with Julian Assange. That's not the point. I mean, I've had people say to me, for example, I don't like his attitude to Hillary Clinton. Too bad. I mean, that's, leave that at the front door, come in, have a discussion, and see this as a humanitarian issue. If we're going to just pick and choose who we support on the basis of their politics, then that's not what human rights is all about, and it shows a great deal of hypocrisy on the part of those who purport to support human rights.
Absolutely. And I think that if any of the viewers and listeners want to access the template that justiceforassange.com has, I will later, or if my tech helpers could please link that to the chats for us, that would be fantastic, because that was a really important document that was provided. There's a template you can use.
I agree, Elizabeth. I agree.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that was important to mention and highlight for people for sure. So are there any final thoughts you think going forward? What do you see in the next couple of weeks and months as far as any changes from Ecuador specifically in this case? What is your kind of forecast with this?
Look, I think the first thing is, get internet restored, come to an agreement with Julian in relation to that. But moving forward, there does need to be a quite clear pathway for Julian to be safe. And the time to do that is now, because things are coming to a head, and the current situation is unsustainable.
Absolutely. And we know that Lenin Moreno, the current president of Ecuador, has called the situation unsustainable, but at that time he was trying to negotiate that, what you call elegant solution to get Assange out. So very important
I totally agree. And thank you for the time today, Elizabeth, and well done on this initiative. I think it's so important to hear these voices. I heard your previous speaker, and as you rightly said, what's interesting about the Assange issue is that it does encapsulate people from across the globe, from different perspectives. It unites them.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. And thank you so much for speaking with us. And again, Greg, I just want to say that Greg is a legal representative of Julian Assange in Australia. And we are so lucky that you have joined us and spoken to us and explained some of these legal issues that are either not known about, like the Pinochet issue, or are misrepresented in other issues and facets of this.
No, thank you for the opportunity.